Have you ever watched a cockpit video and you've seen those spinning things next to the pilots, wondering about what they are and what they do? Well, those are called stabilizer trim wheels, and in this video I will be telling you everything that you need to know about the stabilizer trim system, and I will also tell you what happens if those start to really run away and how the pilots deal with that. You are very welcome to another video here on the Mentour Pilot channel. I hope that you're doing absolutely fantastic. Stay tuned. This video is brought to you in cooperation with Brilliant. So are you sitting here with only about a week to go to Christmas, thinking about what to give to that uncle of yours who has everything, or maybe that niece who needs to pay a little bit more attention in school? In that case, I have a suggestion for you. Why don't you give them a premium membership of Brilliant for a year? Now, Brilliant is a fantastic tool for anyone who is curious, who is a lifelong learner, someone who really likes getting better at things like problem solving, for example, mathematics, or maybe learn coding. It's good for anyone who is a student from about middle school, like my son who's 10 years old, for example. He loves playing and trying to solve their little problems that they have in the website. Or anyone who is a professional who just wants to improve their STEM knowledge, or just anyone who's curious, really. So if you're still looking for a Christmas gift to someone, or maybe you want to gift this kind of knowledge to yourself, then use the link here below. You'll get a whopping 20% off the annual fee. So start giving the gift of knowledge this Christmas. So like I was saying before, what we're going to be talking about in this video is the stabilizer trim system. Okay, but before we start talking about why those things are spinning the way they are, we have to understand a little bit about how the aircraft is controlled during normal circumstances. So we divide the flight controls into two different groups. You have the primary flight controls and you have the secondary flight controls. The primary flight controls are, like the word suggests, the primary means of controlling the aircraft, and that is in the roll plane we use the ailerons. In the yaw plane that moves the nose left and right, we have the rudder in the back. And in the pitch plane, we have something called an elevator that moves the nose up and down. The secondary flight controls are, for example, the flaps and the slats, what we call the high lift devices. There's also the spoilers, the speed brakes on the wings, and it's the trim rudders. Now, you hear the word trimming, and you hear pilots talk about trimming the aircraft all the time, but what does it actually mean? Well, what you want to try to achieve by trimming the aircraft is using these smaller trim rudder surfaces in order to take away the forces that a pilot needs to apply in order to make the aircraft do whatever it is that we want it to do. In this episode, we're going to be talking about the stabilizer trim system, which has to do with the pitch control of the aircraft. So in order to do that, you need to understand how the elevator works and how it can make the aircraft pitch in the first place. So when an aircraft is built, when it's constructed, it is constructed in a way where you have the center of gravity located approximately midway across the wings, right? Center of gravity is where you can kind of think that the entire mass of the aircraft is concentrated. Then you have the center of lift, or the center of pressure, and that is not co-located with the center of gravity that you might think. Instead, the center of lift is a little bit behind the center of gravity. If you know a little bit about physics, you know that if you have a force that is acting away from the center of gravity, you will get a momentum, you'll get a torque, something that's actually moving around the center of gravity. So if you have a lot of lift situated behind the center of gravity, well then that is going to force the nose of the aircraft down, and that's not something that we want. No, in fact what we want is we want the aircraft to stay nice and level. So the amount of lift that the aircraft wing is producing is a lot. It needs to hold the whole aircraft up. But because the center of lift is located just a little bit behind the center of gravity, it means that the moment arm is not very big, right? So the torque is not that big. So in order to counteract that torque, what you can do is you can use a slightly smaller opposite force, but with a bigger moment arm. And that's why you have the horizontal stabilizer, the back wing of an aircraft. Because the back wing actually produces opposite lift, right? The lift that is created by the horizontal stabilizer is pointing downwards. And because it is so far away from the center of gravity, the moment arm that it has is enough to counteract the torque that is going counterclockwise with a clockwise movement. So it ends up being more or less zero. But the way that this is done, it means that because you have this variable lift away from the center of gravity, you now have a way to control the pitch of the aircraft. With me so far? Great. Now, like I said, the way that we control the pitch is by moving the elevator. So that's a small rudder surface on the back of the horizontal stabilizer. So if I want to, for example, get the aircraft to climbing, well then I sit in my cockpit and I pull the yoke towards me. That will deflect the elevator upwards, so it will increase the amount of force that is taken out, the amount of lift that is taken out of this horizontal stabilizer. And because that lift is now higher, it will force the nose upwards and the aircraft starts climbing, and vice versa. The problem though is that if I want to climb for a long while, maybe I want to climb for 20-30 minutes or something, I'm going to have to constantly sit with back pressure on the yoke, right? Sit and then pull the yoke for 20-30 minutes. And anyone who's tried to do anything that involves a little bit of force for 30 minutes knows that that is hard work. We don't want that. Instead, what we want to do is we want to put enough force so that we get the pitch that we want, and then we want to trim away the forces. The way that that is done on the 737 is that we move the entire horizontal stabilizer. So if you have boarded a 737 from the back stairs, you would have seen that as the horizontal stabilizer intersects with the body, there is something that looks like a scale, like a measurement scale. And that is exactly what it is. It shows the angle of the horizontal stabilizer because that moves up and down depending on how much we trim. So in the case of the example I gave, if I want to pitch for 20 degrees, well then I pull back, the elevator will deflect until I have 20 degrees of pitch up. And when I'm there, I'm then going to trim the aircraft backwards. That will move the entire horizontal stabilizer, which will then make the need for elevator deflection less and less. Eventually, they will be flush with each other. And now there is no forces anymore. I can literally let go of the flight controls and the aircraft will continue to climb with 20 degrees nose up. And the thing with trim is that you don't only do that while you want to set a specific pitch. In fact, the trim is constantly changing on the 737, and that's why we need such a large surface to trim it. On smaller aircraft, you have something called a trim tab, which is just a slightly smaller rudder on the back of the elevator that you can set to do the same job. But because the 737 needs to be able to be operated at a huge range of different speeds, and anytime that you move the speed, the trim will also change. And also, you have a lot of high lift devices, huge flaps, that also changes the amount of trim needed. Then you need a huge surface to trim, hence the movable stabilizer, right? By the way, this is also why you see constantly when pilots are hand flying that those trim wheels are moving forward and backwards. That's because the speed might be changing, or the amount of pitch might be changing, or the amount of just back pressure that you need because you're executing a turn, for example, might be changing. And we always train our pilot to constantly get the aircraft in trim. Essentially, you should be flying the aircraft so well trimmed that you can always fly it with 2 fingers, right? Manually, if you're sitting, which a lot of new pilots do, and something that we focus a lot on during the type rating, you're sitting with, as we call white knuckle flying, constantly with input, well then you're not trimming enough and you're making your life really difficult for yourself. There are 3 ways to trim the stabilizer. You can either trim it with the electrical trim switches on the yoke. You move the 2 switches simultaneously, either forward, that will trim the nose down, or backwards, which is click down on the buttons, that will move the nose upwards. And when you use those switches, you will be using two different speeds. So it trims slower when the flaps are retracted, and it trims faster when the flaps are extended. And that's because there are bigger trim movements as you are extending flaps, for example, and you might need to move the trim, as in to get the forces fixed quicker. So what you're actually doing is, when you are using the trim switches, you are activating an electrical motor in the back of the aircraft, which is moving a jack screw that is then moving the stabilizer up and down. But if that electrical motor wouldn't work for some reason, or the connection to the electrical motor through the trim switches isn't working, well, then you have to be able to move the stabilizer trim manually. And you do that by those big spinning things that we've been talking about. Because in those trim wheels, you also have folded into the wheel a manual handle. There's a button on the top of it, you press that button, fold the handle out, and now you can start to manually move the stabilizer trim. And what happens then is that these trim wheels are connected via wires down through the floor, under the floor, all the way back to the jack screw, and it starts moving the jack screw manually. Okay? Now, these wires are incredibly strong, so it is said very, very specifically in the manuals that you can apply as much force as you could possibly think about in order to move these ones. So if it is jammed, feel free to use maximum manual force from both pilots at the same time. It will not break the wires. And the way that these trim kind of handles are made is that they are situated opposite to each other. So if the pilot is flying, for example, and for whatever reason moving the trim wheels is hard. It can be very hard if the aircraft is a lot out of trim, or if the speed is very high. Well, in that case, the pilot monitoring can move over and take one trim wheel handle on one side, the other one on the other side, and move it in kind of like a bicycle movement, like this, right? You can also, if even further force is needed, like I said before, use both pilots. So pilot flying can hold the aircraft with one hand and then use his other hand to trim, and the pilot monitoring can use both hands, and they can together try to get the aircraft trimmed. All right? So those are the first two. Now the third way to move the stabilizer is by the autopilot. The autopilot is engaged, the autopilot will have full authority over the stab trim. And this is why when you are watching a cockpit video on the aircraft sitting there with the autopilot engaged, maybe in cruise, all of a sudden you can see these wheels starting to move. Maybe just a couple of turns or one turn, but it is moving now and then, more or less all the time. And that is just because, you know, as we are flying along in cruise and we're burning fuel, for example, then the trim of the aircraft changes. Or maybe there is a lot of people standing in the toilet queue in the front of the aircraft. In that case, there's a little bit of backward trim needed, right? So seeing those trim wheels move is something that we're fairly used to, right? In fact, for me, it is actually a source of good situational awareness, because as those trim wheels are moving, it tells me something about the aircraft state. If I, for example, is flying straight ahead and all of a sudden, without the pilot engaged, the trim starts moving backwards, that is an indication that potentially we are losing speed. Because as the speed goes back, the nose of the aircraft needs to go higher in order to maintain the same altitude. And as it does so, the aircraft will do so by trimming backwards. So if the aircraft is constantly trimming backwards, that might be an indication of the speed decaying, and vice versa. So I actually like seeing those trim wheels. Now, if you look on top of the trim wheels, just next to them, you see that there's a scale there, and that scale represents how much the aircraft is trimmed forward or backward. There is a little green area on top of it. That green area is the allowed trim for takeoff. Because one of the most important things that the pilots do during their pre-flight calculations is calculate the weight and balance of the aircraft. Now, I've done a specific video, you can check that out later on. But essentially, when we get our load sheet, well, then we have to start and we have to input either into our manuals or into our electronic flight bag where everyone is seated. So do we have a lot of people sitting in the front of the aircraft, in the back, or in the middle? Where is the cargo? How much fuel do we have on board? And we input all of that, and then we see where the center of gravity is. Because of that, we can then set how much trim we should have. And this is crucial, because if the correct trim is not set for takeoff, well then either you have too much back trim in that case, as you're rolling down for takeoff, the aircraft might start rotating before you reach the speed for takeoff. You need to hold against it. Or if you have too much forward trim in that case, when you come to your rotation speed and you want to rotate, you might not be able to, because it's just too nose heavy. So having the correct stabilizer trim set for takeoff is absolutely crucial. And if we would, for whatever reason, have put the trim outside of this green area, as we set takeoff thrust on the runway, we are going to get what we call a takeoff configuration warning. It's a warning that sounds exactly like the cabin altitude warning, and it basically tells us to not take off because something is unsafe. It's not set for takeoff. Okay. Now, what kind of failures might we experience then? Well, you have the one failure where the stabilizer trim gets jammed. If the stabilizer trim gets jammed, maybe there's something wrong with the jackscrew, for example, it has been twisted or something has happened to it so it cannot move. Well, in that case, we are going to have to fly the aircraft using the elevator only, and that is perfectly possible, providing that it has been jammed in a more or less normal situation, so it's not either full forward or full aft. We are going to be able to handle the aircraft in the full speed range. It's going to take a lot of muscle power though. So we might have to, we obviously go through the non-normal checklist, try to, apply as much force as possible to the manual trimming of it to kind of break it out of the jam. But if that's not possible, then we would brief. Maybe one of us would fly for a while and then we would switch in order to let the other one rest. And make sure that whoever is going to fly the approach is well rested, because during the approach, that's when we have some really big trim changes with the extension of flaps and gear and so on. The other thing that might happen is what we call a runaway stabilizer. That's when the stabilizer starts moving in one direction or the other without any input from us. Right? That can be because of a failure of the electric motor in the back, for example, or a breakage of something. In whatever reason, the stabilizer trim starts moving in the wrong direction. Now, the first thing that we need to do here is realizing that this is happening. Because, like I was saying, we're used to seeing the stab trim moving. So if it starts to constantly move in one direction, it might take a while for us to realize that it's actually a failure and that it's not the autopilot who's doing it. Now, if you're flying manually, you'll notice it very quickly because you will obviously feel that there's more and more forces needed to be applied to the elevator. And then when you try to trim, nothing happens. So you should figure it out fairly quickly then. And when you do, it's really important that it's being communicated. Right? You need to tell pilot monitoring that's happened, because pilot monitoring might think it's you who's trimming. Okay? So it's almost impossible for pilot monitoring to figure out that this is happening. So communicate, we have a problem with the stabilizer, I think we have a runaway stabilizer. If you're an autopilot, the first indication that you'll get is probably that the autopilot disconnects, because it will be inputting elevator against the trim until it cannot do it anymore. And when it cannot do it, it will just disconnect. And then you might get a very violent pitch up or pitch down. So that would be nasty. In any case, once it has been established that you have a stabilizer runaway, then we call for the memory items. These are items, checklist items, that needs to be done from memory quickly because they are critical for the safety of the flight. In this case, the first thing you do is control column, hold firmly. Speaks for itself, because otherwise you might lose pitch control of the aircraft. Next thing you do is autopilot disconnect and auto throttle disconnect. And then you evaluate. So once this gets disconnected, you might release pressure on the trim, because you can use the trim switches to kind of stop the trim from moving. Release it, see, does it still move? Does it still run away? If the answer to that is no, in that case you've solved the problem, you can now continue to fly just, trimming manually. If it still moves, well then we move down to the next memory item, which is stabilizer trim cutoff switches to cutoff. Those are the two cutoff switches that are situated to the right of the start levers on the right side of the center column, and those are just flicked down. And then once again evaluate, did that sort the problem? Once again, if it sorted the problem, you trim manually. If that didn't sort the problem and the aircraft is still trimming, this means that it had nothing to do with the electrical system nor the autopilot. In that case, you're going to have to stop this manually. So the last memory item is stabilizer trim wheel grasp and hold. Okay, so the trim wheel is now moving, the pilot monitoring is going to have to grab a hold of it and just by force stop the stabilizer from moving. Now there are some techniques involved in this. If you have time, which you probably don't have, there are fire gloves next to each pilot. You can take one of those fire gloves on in order to protect yourself from the burn that you might get from it, and also try to keep a straight arm. Grab the trim wheel like this. Avoid grabbing it like this because you could break your wrist. In any case, that is not a good situation to be in, but it is still fixable. Okay? So those are the different malfunctions that you might come across. Now, I'm guessing that, as always, you probably have more questions regarding this, okay? If you do, then file them into the comments below. I love hearing from you. It's always interesting to see what you guys are wondering about. Maybe you have suggestions for more videos to be made. And if you want to talk to me, feel free to join up with my Discord server, or if you're interested in getting the best aviation news every single day, then get my free Mentour Aviation app, right? I have links to both the Discord and the Mentour Aviation app here below. And obviously, before I go, I want to say a huge thank you again to Brilliant, who is the sponsor of this episode. If you're looking for a really good, appreciated Christmas gift, well then, go down, click the link below and get 20% off on the premium membership of Brilliant for a full year. Have an absolutely fantastic day wherever you are, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye. Right guys, I really hope that you liked that. If you want more content like that, more aviation content, well then, check this out. I hope that you have subscribed to the channel and that you've highlighted the little notification bell. See you inside of the Mentour Aviation app and have an absolutely fantastic day. Bye-bye.